So, you want to learn Spanish, but you're not sure why you should do it. Or perhaps you've tried learning Spanish before, found it a little bit too hard, and quit. Well, in today's video, I'm going to be giving you 10 reasons why you should keep learning Spanish so that you can reach your goal of becoming a bilingual. 15 years ago, when I started to learn Spanish, it was very easy for me to find people to interact with in the language. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, and if you know anything about the United States, you know that there are many people who come from Mexico to Texas. So, how did I get into learning Spanish, and what did I find to be the most difficult? For starters, I got into Spanish because I was working in sales at the time. Whenever I would go to different homes and try to sell people the items that I had, it was very difficult for me to interact with most of them. If you live in the United States, you've probably experienced this yourself, but it is a very simple fix. If you put in a little bit of time each day, you can learn Spanish very quickly and be able to have a conversation. The first obvious benefit for learning Spanish for me was to help me in my job. And this is a common reason people try to learn Spanish. In fact, on average, people who speak Spanish as well as English earn 20% more than monolingual people in the same profession. So, just to put that into perspective for you, if you're earning $20,000 a year, you can increase that to $25,000 a year just by speaking Spanish and being able to communicate with more people. So, that's the first obvious benefit. Now, what is the second obvious benefit and how can it help you? Well, the second benefit is that you're going to be able to interact with more people. Whenever you can interact with more people, you can make more friends. Making more friends is going to open you up to new cultures, new experiences, and it's going to make your life a lot more fun. Rather than just sitting and watching TV and understanding one part of the world, you're going to be able to understand so much more by learning Spanish. So that's the second obvious benefit. Now, let's move on to how many people speak Spanish in the world because a lot of people overlook this. Spanish, the fourth most spoken language in the world. And even though it doesn't compare so much with English, this is a huge section of the world you're not able to communicate with if you don't speak Spanish. So, by being able to speak to this many people, you're going to open yourself up to a whole new world of possibility. If you go to a country where they speak Spanish, you'll be able to walk around and see everything and ask for help and avoid the confusion that usually comes with traveling to a country where you don't understand the language. So, that for me was a huge benefit because if you go to my website and if you read my blogs, you'll see that I've lived in many different countries. So, being able to communicate with people was very important for me. And if you think about Spanish, 500 million people is a lot of people. So, by learning how to speak Spanish, you are increasing your ability to communicate in the world, get better jobs, make new friends, understand a huge part of media that is being used, especially in America, every day. The fourth benefit that I'm going to tell you actually has nothing to do with helping yourself get a job or being able to speak to more people. If you're an avid learner or an avid reader, you probably want to understand culture from everywhere. It's likely that you've read books from China, it's likely that you've read stories from the Middle East. All of these stories are passed down through people to their children and from their children to their children. And being able to understand these stories will help you understand the world and how people work on a deeper level. So for me, a big part of learning Spanish was being able to understand the language and being able to understand different things that I saw on the television. So that's another huge benefit of learning Spanish. If you understand the language, you can understand what you're seeing on TV a little bit more. Here's one that's a little bit more fun. When I started to learn Spanish, the first thing that helped me was to start listening to music in Spanish. I know this can be a little bit scary if you don't understand Spanish or have a huge language base, but trust me, it does work. As a matter of fact, when I started learning Spanish, I was listening to music before I could even say hello. And my aunt came up to me one day and she said, "Oh, Sean, why are you listening to this music in Spanish? You're never going to be able to learn this language." Well, joke's on her because 15 years later, I speak it to a nearly native level. So, listening to music, how does this help you? Well, it's first important to realize that listening to music in Spanish is going to help you with your input. And that's the biggest factor that's going to help you either succeed or fail in learning a language. You need to have native input going into your ears so your brain can process this information. So, listening to music has a couple benefits. The first is that you do get that native input. You get to hear how the language is used. The second benefit to listening to music is actually something people overlook. If you are listening to music that was originally in English and then put in Spanish, your brain, because you already understand the context of the message and you already understand the basic message of the song, will start to put the pieces together and you'll start to understand the conventions of the language and how it works. So, how did I do this to help me learn Spanish in listening to music? The benefit is you can finally understand any of the songs that you might hear and enjoy and understand exactly what they're saying. So, how exactly did I employ this to be able to learn Spanish to such a high level? Well, I started with what I know. So, a lot of people say, well, how do you find music that you know when you are listening to Spanish? A lot of times you have artists like Rosalia, you have, artists like Gloria Trevi, you have tons of different artists, and none of these people sing in English. And if they do, the English is usually not as good as the Spanish. So, how did I do this? Well, I started with what I knew. I knew when I was younger, I used to watch a bunch of Disney movies, The Little Mermaid, Hercules, any of these movies that you can think of where you already understand the message and they have songs, of course, right? They have songs and everybody loves these songs. So, if you listen to these songs in English, you already understand the meaning, you already understand the context, and this is going to be exponentially helpful so that you can learn more Spanish. So listen to those songs in English and then go on YouTube. You can find videos where all of these songs are in different languages. Find them in Spanish, listen to them, and make sure the captions are on. So that's the next benefit of learning Spanish to a very high level. The fifth benefit for me was being able to advance my career. So once I understood more people, it allowed me to be able to communicate with more people effectively. And especially if you're working in sales, this is huge. If you're working in education, it's even better. By trade, I'm a bilingual teacher. So that means I help students who come to America who don't understand English, and I help them to access our curriculum to be able to understand English a little better. And eventually, over time, what I do is I help them go from zero to being able to speak just like you and I do. Now, this does take a little bit of time, but these students, they have a lot of input. They're constantly hearing English in school, and the only time that they're not hearing it is usually at home. So, for me, learning Spanish helped me not only identify better with my students and help them understand that they can learn English, but it also helped me when I was in a sales job because I was able to communicate more effectively what I wanted to do. And this really is going to lead me into the next benefit, the sixth big benefit of learning Spanish. And that's going to be that it improves your brain function. So, when we start to think about people and their brains, as they get older, they start to develop some cognitive impairments. This means, they could start to forget things, but you can actually prevent this if you learn a second language. It will increase your brain function. That way, you have less chance of developing Alzheimer's or something like this in the future. And I'm speaking from experience. Whenever I have to complete a task, if I do it in Spanish, my critical thinking skills are usually a little bit higher because I'm not just thinking about the task itself, but I'm thinking about it in a different language. It allows me to be much more rational and really understand points of view and improve my critical thinking skills to solve a problem that is difficult for me. So, this was a very big one for me when I was learning Spanish as well. I immediately noticed the benefit of learning Spanish because my critical thinking skills improved massively. Now, let's move on to number six. And this one is my absolute favorite because I talk to people from all around the world. If you speak Spanish, you're going to be able to make so many new friends. And I know a lot of people get a little bit scared when they're talking to people trying to make new friends. But trust me, whenever you're learning Spanish, Spanish people and people from Mexico, anybody who speaks Spanish really, they love to speak their own language. Now, I want you to think about a time that you were in the United States. Maybe you went to the grocery store, maybe you went to the doctor, and there was somebody there speaking Spanish. How much better does it make you feel when that person tries to communicate with you in English? I bet it probably makes you feel very, very happy. And, I got to tell you, whenever you talk to Spanish speakers and you try to speak their language, it also makes them feel very, very good. So, nobody is going to look at you and say, oh, this is not your language. Try to speak English. It just doesn't happen. You might find a couple people. I can remember one time I went to a meat shop and I was trying to get some food for my grandmother to cook. And I walked in and I was trying to talk to the people in Spanish, and my Spanish was at a very low level at this time. And this is really the only time I ever had somebody say, oh, well, talk to me in English. The person I was trying to talk to got a little bit angry because she said that my Spanish wasn't perfect. Now, that might be a little bit scary to you, but I have to promise you something, if you're putting in all of this effort to learn a second language and you are talking to people in Spanish, this is very, very rare. In the entire 15 years that I've been learning Spanish up to my level now, I've only had two people tell me, "Hey, speak English." People just don't do it because when they see that you're trying to learn something, it invigorates them, it makes them happy, and it makes them feel good because you're trying to communicate with them in their language through their culture. So you're going to be able to make so many new friends just by trying to speak another language. And here's the cool thing about my course. Anybody that signs up for a course with me, they're going to be put into a group of English learners and Spanish learners. That way these two can interact. So, I've gone through and I've done the work. That way I can match you guys up to speak exactly with who you want to. That's going to help you improve your Spanish level. So, that's a really cool thing that I do in my course that I haven't really seen anywhere else. And if that's something you're interested in, go ahead, click the link in the description and you'll be taken to check this out. But if not, let's move on to number 7. Number 7 is that you're going to be able to massively increase your sex appeal. And I know this sounds a little bit silly, but when I lived in Texas, I used to talk to so many people who didn't speak English. I went out of my way to find these people. And, me, a white person, whenever I go up and start speaking in Spanish, the first thing that goes through their mind is, oh, he speaks Spanish a little bit. But the more we talk and the more that we elaborate on the conversation and the more detail that I go into and the more accurately I can describe myself in Spanish, it's led many people to say, wow, that is really hot. And, at the time when I did this, I was like 100 pounds lighter. So, I wasn't always a chunky monkey. But it really, really helped people to tell me, even if they didn't find me physically attractive, they would say, wow, you're really smart and it's really a turn on. So, speaking a second language can actually massively increase your sex appeal as well. And Spanish is the perfect language to do it in because Spanish is the language of love. It sounds beautiful, the rhythm of it, and being able to express yourself in this is definitely going to attract some new looks. You might turn some eyes when you're in a store. So I can tell you that firsthand. It will definitely help increase your sex appeal, and it can actually help you even if somebody doesn't think you're attractive initially. It can really, really help them to find you attractive. So learning Spanish definitely has a benefit there. This is going to sound a little silly because you might say, oh, well, I speak English to a native level already. That might be true, but when you learn Spanish, it is going to improve your English. Now, what do I mean by this? Whenever you're learning Spanish, what you'll find is that a lot of high level words in English are actually basic words in Spanish. Let me give you a good example here. So, whenever we think of a building, in English, we're going to say, oh, well, look, that's a big building or that's a small building. But the thing is, in Spanish, you don't say that. In Spanish, the word is edificio. And a lot of people say, well, what in the hell is that? But if you actually look up the word, the translation, you might see building, but if you look up a higher register word in English, you're going to find the word edifice. And an edifice is a freestanding, essentially, it's a building. By learning these basic Spanish words, might I add, basic Spanish words, you're going to start to broaden your vocabulary in English as well. Whenever I learned Spanish, sometimes I would learn the word and I'd look it up in English and I would say, wow, I didn't even know that that was an English word. But through time, as I started to see more and more of these words, it really improved my English. And these two kind of work together. The better your Spanish gets, the better your English will become. And the better your English becomes, essentially, the more Spanish that you're going to understand because a lot of these really basic words in Spanish are high level words in English. So, this is a massive benefit of learning a second language. It's going to improve your first language as well, in this instance, English. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, it's going to make your Spanish and your English a lot better. And when you start to notice how these two work together, your skills are really going to ignite and you're going to take off and you're going to start speaking Spanish at a faster pace and learning more than you ever thought you could. So for me, that was a huge benefit. Now, the last benefit, we're going on to number 10, is what if you want to live abroad? I know a lot of people get scared of living abroad, but I have lived abroad for the last 10 years. Currently, I'm based in the United Kingdom, but I frequently travel to Spain doing work, meeting students, sometimes doing some copywriting for some dentists over there, maybe some facial surgeons as well. And I have to tell you, being able to travel freely around the world to any country I want and being able to communicate with someone is massively important for me. I used to live in China, and when I was in China, of course, I didn't speak Chinese. My Chinese is not that great. I'm going to tell you right now, my Chinese is absolute crap. But I went to a restaurant one day with one of my friends, and neither her nor myself could speak Chinese, so we were really struggling trying to order some food. And what we found out was when the guy came to the table, he heard me listening to a song in Spanish, and he said, "Wow." He told me it in perfect Spanish. He's like, "Hablas español?" And I was like, what? Yes, of course I speak Spanish. And, this is China, a place where you think, people aren't going to know Spanish. Most people there focus on English. But I have to tell you that, I was mind blown. This person, this Chinese person at the restaurant started speaking to me in perfect Spanish. And he and I were able to communicate in Spanish to order our food, get whatever we needed, pay the bill. It was absolutely fantastic. And it's something that people overlook. If you learn English and Spanish, that's going to enable you to speak with almost anyone on this planet. Because if we think about the numbers, there are almost 500 million people who speak Spanish in the world. It is the fourth most spoken language on the planet. And if we think about English, well, you already know that's the language of business. That's lingua franca. That means that everybody uses English every day. People actively invest time and money to learn English. The 10th and biggest benefit, in my opinion, of learning Spanish, and it's that if you learn it, anywhere you go as a native speaker, you will be able to find someone to communicate in. It might not be in the language of the country, but for example, if you go to Germany, your chances of finding somebody that speaks English is very, very high. If you go to China, probably still the chances of finding someone who speaks English are very high. But in both of these countries, you can also find people that speak Spanish, people who actively invest their time to learn this language because they see the massive benefit of being able to speak with more people. So I hope you guys can understand why it's so important to be bilingual, and I hope you guys can understand a little bit better why I decided to learn Spanish and why I'm making it my mission to help people like you who maybe had some issues before learning how to speak Spanish, or maybe took a few classes and failed it and thought this is too hard. Learn Spanish, because if you put in the time and you use the method that I have, I promise you'll speak Spanish fluently in record time. So if it's something you're interested in, go ahead, check out the description, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye-bye.